Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of history's most horrifying acts of calculated cruelty. A single day when Byzantine generals systematically blinded 15,000 prisoners of war, leaving just. You've probably heard sanitized versions of medieval warfare, where knights fought with honor and mercy was common. The reality? Medieval battlefields were theaters of unimaginable brutality. And what happened on July 29, 1014, near a fortress called Cledion, represents one of the most methodical acts of mass mutilation in recorded history. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world, especially when we're diving into stories this dark. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background. Tonight's journey takes us deep into the Byzantine Empire at its most ruthless, where an emperor earned the nickname Bulgar Slayer through acts so brutal they traumatized entire generations. We'll explore not just what happened, but why it happened, the decades of warfare, the political calculations, and the twisted logic that convinced one of history's most successful rulers that blinding 15,000 men was a rational military strategy. You see, this isn't just a story about medieval brutality. It's about how civilized, sophisticated empires can convince themselves that exceptional cruelty serves humanitarian purposes. It's about the moment when psychological warfare became a science, and human suffering became a tool to be wielded with the same precision as siege engines or cavalry charges. Most disturbingly, it's about how effective these methods actually were because the systematic blinding of 15,000 prisoners accomplished something that decades of traditional warfare could not: the complete and permanent destruction of Bulgarian resistance to imperial authority. The Byzantine Empire of 1014 wasn't some barbaric kingdom ruled by sadistic madmen. It was the most sophisticated state in Europe, heir to Rome's governmental traditions, guardian of Greek intellectual heritage, and a home to the world's most advanced military thinking. The men who planned and executed the mass mutilation of prisoners weren't monsters. They were rational administrators implementing policy designed to solve strategic problems that threatened imperial survival. And let's ease into tonight's journey together, back to a world where empires were built on fear. Mercy was often seen as weakness, and the difference between civilization and savagery was often just a matter of organizational efficiency. We're going to explore how intelligent people convinced themselves that industrial-scale torture was not only acceptable but necessary, and how a single act of calculated brutality changed the course of medieval European history. The empire that refused to die. You're standing in Constantinople in the year 1000 CE, and despite what you might expect, you're not witnessing the decline of the Roman Empire. You're seeing its continuation. The Byzantine Empire, as we call it now, considered itself the direct heir of Rome, and its citizens called themselves Romans right up until 1453. But this isn't the Rome of Caesar or Augustus. This is something far more complex, far more paranoid, and infinitely more dangerous. The morning air carries the scent of incense from Hagia Sophia, mixed with the salt breeze from the Bosphorus. But underneath it all, there's something else: the metallic smell of fear. You see, by 1000 CE, the Byzantine Empire had survived for over 6 centuries since the fall of Rome's western half, but survival had come at a cost. The empire had developed an almost pathological obsession with eliminating threats before they could fully materialize. Walking through the streets of the capital, you'd notice something immediately. Everyone watches everyone else. The Byzantine court had perfected the art of political paranoia to a degree that would make modern dictatorships jealous. Informants weren't just common, they were expected. Your neighbor might report your dinner conversation to imperial agents, who would then file detailed reports about your loyalty to the emperor. This wasn't just authoritarian control, it was a survival. mechanism developed by a state that had learned that internal threats could be just as dangerous as external enemies. The empire's approach to governance reflected centuries of hard-learned lessons about survival in a hostile world. You'd see this in everything from the elaborate court ceremonies designed to emphasize imperial power, to the complex bureaucratic systems that ensured no single individual could accumulate enough authority to challenge the emperor, to the sophisticated intelligence networks that monitored potential threats throughout the known world. But this wasn't paranoia without cause. The empire faced threats from literally every direction. To the east, the Abbasid Caliphate controlled vast territories and commanded armies that had repeatedly threatened Byzantine heartlands. These weren't primitive tribal raiders. They were the heirs of a civilization that had conquered much of the known world and possessed military technologies that rivaled anything the Byzantines could field. Arab armies had proven capable of siege warfare that could reduce the empire's most formidable fortifications, naval operations that threatened imperial control of vital sea routes, and diplomatic initiatives that could turn Byzantine allies into enemies. To the north, various Slavic tribes and kingdoms pressed against imperial borders, sometimes as allies, sometimes as enemies, always as wildcards that could dramatically alter the strategic balance in southeastern Europe. These groups had learned to exploit Byzantine political divisions, often supporting one imperial claimant against another in civil wars that could last for decades and devastate entire regions. Worse, they had begun to adopt Byzantine military techniques and governmental structures, creating the possibility of sophisticated Slavic states that could challenge imperial authority using the empire's own methods against it. To the west, the Holy Roman Empire claimed to be the true heir of Rome, making every Byzantine emperor a usurper in their eyes. This wasn't just political rivalry. It was an existential challenge to the fundamental legitimacy of Byzantine authority. The Western Empire possessed resources and manpower that matched or exceeded Byzantine capabilities, and its rulers actively worked to undermine imperial influence throughout Europe through diplomatic, military, and religious initiatives designed to isolate Constantinople and reduce its international standing. And then there was Bulgaria, which by 1000 CE had become the most dangerous threat the empire faced. The First Bulgarian Empire had been fighting the Byzantines on and off for over 2 centuries. And this wasn't some minor border dispute or occasional raiding. This was existential warfare between 2 sophisticated states that both claimed the same territories and neither of which could achieve decisive victory through conventional military means. You need to understand what made Bulgaria particularly threatening from a Byzantine perspective. This wasn't a primitive tribal confederation that could be easily conquered or bought off. It was a sophisticated state that had successfully adopted the best elements of Byzantine administration while maintaining fierce independence and territorial ambitions that directly threatened imperial survival. Bulgarian rulers had learned to exploit Byzantine political weaknesses, often forming alliances with other imperial enemies that could create strategic situations where the empire faced simultaneous threats from multiple directions. The Bulgarian military had also evolved to match Byzantine capabilities in almost every significant category. Their infantry could match imperial forces in close combat. Their cavalry was equally skilled at both light harassment and heavy shock tactics, and they had mastered the art of siege warfare that allowed them to capture and hold fortified positions that the Byzantines considered impregnable. Most importantly, they fought with the desperate intensity of people defending their homeland against an empire that viewed their very existence as illegitimate. By 1000 CE, you're witnessing an empire that had developed a culture where moral squeamishness was seen as a luxury the state couldn't afford. The Byzantine court had concluded through centuries of bitter experience that survival required methods that transcended normal ethical considerations, and that mercy was often interpreted as weakness that could cost the empire everything. This wasn't sadism. It was strategic thinking that had been refined through generations of imperial administrators who had learned that conventional approaches to warfare and diplomacy were insufficient for dealing with existential threats. The emperor, who would orchestrate the blinding of 15,000 prisoners, was already on the throne by 1000 CE, though few could have predicted the brutality he would eventually unleash. Basil II had inherited an empire in crisis, facing rebellions from within and invasions from without, and he had already demonstrated a willingness to use extreme measures to maintain control. But what was coming would shock even his contemporaries and establish precedents for psychological warfare that would influence military thinking for centuries. Standing in Constantinople in 1000 CE, watching imperial troops march through the streets, you'd see an army that looked remarkably different from the legions of classical Rome. These soldiers wore lamellar armor that gleamed like fish scales, carried weapons that showed influences from across the known world, and spoke Greek rather than Latin. But their discipline, their organization, and their absolute loyalty to the emperor would have made Marcus Aurelius proud. The empire's military machine was designed for one purpose: ensuring that Rome, because that's what they called themselves, would never fall again. Every tactic, every strategy, every horrifying innovation in warfare served that single goal. The blinding of 15,000 prisoners wasn't an aberration. It was the logical culmination of centuries of imperial thinking that prioritized long-term survival over short-term mercy. You wouldn't know it yet, standing there in the morning light of the new millennium. But the stage was already set for one of history's most calculated acts of mass mutilation. The Bulgar Slayer rises. You're in the imperial palace in 976 CE, and you're witnessing something that will reshape the medieval world. The coronation of a 10-year-old boy who will grow up to become one of history's most ruthless rulers. Basil II is small for his age, pale, and unremarkable in almost every way except for his eyes. Even as a child, those eyes held something that made grown men uncomfortable, a calculating coldness that suggested he was always thinking several moves ahead. The palace around you buzzes with the kind of tension that comes when powerful people suddenly find themselves dealing with a child emperor. You can hear whispered conversations in alcoves, see meaningful glances exchanged between ministers, and feel the electric anticipation of a power vacuum waiting to be filled. What you're witnessing is the moment when the Byzantine Empire either becomes vulnerable to internal collapse or produces a ruler who will dominate the medieval world for half a century. The coronation ceremony itself reveals the sophisticated political theater that surrounded imperial power. You'd see rituals that had been refined over centuries to emphasize both the religious and secular authority of the emperor, with every gesture and word carefully calculated to reinforce the idea that imperial power came directly from God and could not be legitimately challenged by mortal authorities. But underneath this elaborate display, you'd sense the very real uncertainty about whether a 10-year-old child could command the respect and fear necessary to hold together an empire facing threats from every direction. Basil wasn't supposed to rule alone. Imperial protocol demanded co-emperors, and his younger brother Constantine VIII was crowned alongside him. But even at 10 years old, it was clear to everyone present that Basil was the one who mattered. Constantine preferred books and theology. Basil studied military manuals and maps. Constantine charmed courtiers with wit and conversation. Basil memorized the names and loyalties of every significant military commander in the empire. The difference between the brothers was immediately apparent to anyone who spent time observing the imperial court. The child emperor's first months in power revealed a mind that was already operating according to principles that would later produce the systematic blinding of 15,000 prisoners. Basil approached every political problem as a puzzle to be solved through the application of precise force, and he demonstrated an early understanding that mercy was often interpreted as weakness in a world where imperial authority depended on the perception of invincibility. You'd see this in his treatment of court officials, who had served under his predecessor. Rather than simply replacing them with his own appointees, Basil carefully evaluated each individual's loyalty, competence, and potential threat to imperial authority. Those who passed his assessment were retained and rewarded. Those who failed simply disappeared, often without any public acknowledgement of their fate. This wasn't random paranoia. It was systematic evaluation and elimination of potential threats, according to criteria that the young emperor had already developed with frightening sophistication. The first real test came almost immediately. You're now in Anatolia in 978 CE, 2 years after Basil's coronation, and you're watching a 20,000-man rebel army march toward Constantinople under the command of Bardas Skleros, one of the empire's most experienced generals. Skleros had decided that a child emperor was exactly the opportunity he'd been waiting for, and half the empire's military aristocracy agreed with him. This was the kind of internal threat that had destroyed previous emperors and could easily have ended Byzantine power permanently. But here's what Skleros didn't understand about the 12-year-old emperor he was marching to depose. Basil II had spent every day since his coronation studying not just military strategy, but human psychology. While other children played games, Basil learned to read people's motivations, to understand what drove men to loyalty or rebellion, and most importantly, to identify exactly what kind of punishment would most effectively deter future threats. The young emperor's response to Skleros's rebellion revealed strategic thinking that was already operating at a level that would eventually produce the mass mutilation of prisoners as a routine tool of imperial policy. Rather than simply raising an army to meet the rebels in battle, Basil implemented a comprehensive strategy that combined military, diplomatic, and psychological elements designed to not just defeat the immediate threat, but permanently eliminate the possibility of similar challenges to imperial authority. Basil's approach to the rebellion demonstrated his early understanding that traditional military victories were insufficient for maintaining long-term imperial security. They needed to create examples that would be remembered for generations, establishing precedents that would make future rebels think twice before challenging imperial authority. This wasn't just about winning a civil war. It was about establishing the psychological foundations for a reign that would last 50 years and fundamentally reshape the medieval world. The civil war that followed lasted 6 brutal years, but what made it particularly significant wasn't its duration or casualties. It was the methods that the child emperor developed for dealing with defeated enemies. You'd think a young ruler would rely on advisors to develop policy for handling prisoners and rebels. But Basil personally supervised every aspect of punishment and clemency, treating each decision as a learning opportunity that would inform future imperial policy. When rebel commanders were captured, they didn't simply face execution or exile. Basil developed elaborate punishment systems designed to serve multiple strategic purposes simultaneously, eliminating immediate threats, deterring future rebellions, and demonstrating imperial power to both domestic and international audiences. These weren't random acts of cruelty. They were carefully calculated applications of psychological warfare that revealed a mind already operating according to principles that would eventually produce industrial-scale torture as routine imperial policy. The young emperor also demonstrated an early mastery of what would become his signature approach to international relations, thinking in terms of decades-long strategies designed to permanently eliminate threats rather than simply winning individual battles or campaigns. When he looked at enemies like Bardas Skleros, he didn't just see immediate military problems to be solved. He saw opportunities to establish precedents that would influence imperial policy for generations. By 984 CE, you're watching an 18-year-old emperor who had already survived multiple assassination attempts, crushed 2 major rebellions, and begun to develop the methodical approach to warfare that would eventually lead to the blinding of 15,000 prisoners. Basil had learned through direct experience that mercy was often interpreted as weakness. And weakness in an emperor could lead to civil wars that killed far more people than strategic brutality ever would. But it was his approach to dealing with defeated rebels that really revealed the sophistication of his strategic thinking. When Scleros was finally captured in 979 CE, you might have expected a quick execution or honorable exile. Instead, Basil ordered something far more psychologically sophisticated. Scleros was blinded and then forced to live as a pensioner in the imperial court, a daily reminder to any potential rebels of what happened to those who challenged imperial authority. This wasn't just punishment. It was performance art designed to instill fear in anyone who might consider similar challenges to imperial power. The blinded rebel became a living symbol of imperial authority, proof that the emperor could not only defeat his enemies, but transform them into instruments of psychological warfare that would serve imperial interests for the rest of their lives. Standing in the imperial palace in 984 CE, observing this pale, intense young man studying maps and casualty reports, you're seeing the intellectual architecture being built that would support one of history's most systematic acts of mass brutality. The stage was being set, piece by piece, for an act of calculated cruelty that would echo through history and earn one man the title Bulgar Slayer. The Bulgarian threat that wouldn't die. You're standing in Pliska, the capital of the First Bulgarian Empire, in 985 CE, and what you're seeing would terrify any Byzantine strategist. This isn't some primitive tribal confederation that can be easily conquered or bought off. This is a sophisticated state that has successfully adopted the best elements of Byzantine administration while maintaining fierce independence and territorial ambitions that directly threaten imperial survival. The morning air carries the sound of hammers on metal from workshops producing weapons that are indistinguishable from those used by Byzantine forces. Bulgarian smiths had mastered the art of creating lamellar armor. Their cavalry tactics rivaled those of Constantinople's finest units. And most disturbingly from a Byzantine perspective, they had developed a governmental structure that could survive the death of individual rulers. This wasn't a kingdom held together by personal loyalty to a single charismatic leader. This was an institutional state that could fight the Byzantine Empire as an equal. Walking through Pliska streets, you'd notice something that would have chilled any Byzantine observer. Prosperity. The Bulgarians weren't struggling barbarians fighting for survival. They were a wealthy, organized people who had built their empire through a combination of military success and administrative competence. Their markets bustled with goods from across the known world. Their churches rivaled those of Constantinople in architectural sophistication, and their army could field forces that matched Byzantine legions in both size and quality. The city's layout itself revealed the strategic thinking that made Bulgaria such a dangerous enemy. Pliska wasn't just a political capital. It was a fortress city designed by engineers who understood both Byzantine siege techniques and the specific geographical advantages of the Balkan terrain. Every street was positioned to maximize defensive advantages. Every building could serve as a strong point in case of siege. And the entire urban complex was designed to support prolonged resistance against the kind of systematic siege warfare that the Byzantines had perfected over centuries. But what made Bulgaria truly dangerous wasn't its military strength. It was its ideological challenge to Byzantine supremacy. The Bulgarians had accepted Orthodox Christianity, but they insisted on administrative independence from Constantinople. They used Cyrillic script rather than Greek, maintained their own patriarch, and most provocatively, their rulers took the title of Tsar, which literally meant Caesar, implying equality with the Byzantine emperor. You need to understand what this meant in the context of Byzantine political theory. The empire didn't just claim to be the heir of Rome. It claimed to be Rome, continuing an unbroken chain of legitimate authority stretching back to Augustus. Any independent Christian state that claimed imperial titles wasn't just a political rival. It was a theological and historical impossibility that threatened the entire conceptual foundation of Byzantine authority. The Bulgarian challenge was made even more dangerous by the sophistication of their diplomatic strategy. Standing in the royal palace in Pliska, you'd see evidence of diplomatic correspondence with kingdoms throughout Europe, all designed to create strategic alliances that could isolate the Byzantine Empire and prevent it from bringing its full military strength to bear against Bulgarian territories. These weren't desperate attempts to find allies against overwhelming odds. They were calculated diplomatic initiatives by a state that understood international politics as well as any power in medieval Europe. By 985 CE, you're witnessing the reign of Samuel of Bulgaria, a ruler who understood exactly how to exploit Byzantine weaknesses. Samuel had transformed Bulgaria from a regional power into a genuine threat to Byzantine survival by pursuing a strategy that was both militarily and psychologically sophisticated. He didn't just raid Byzantine territory. He systematically conquered it, establishing permanent control over regions that Constantinople considered core imperial lands. Samuel's approach to warfare revealed a deep understanding of Byzantine military psychology and strategic doctrine. Rather than engaging in the kind of pitched battles where imperial forces could utilize their superior organization and equipment, Bulgarian armies specialized in the kind of guerrilla warfare that maximized their knowledge of local terrain, while minimizing the advantages that the Byzantines derived from their sophisticated military hierarchy. The Bulgarian military had also developed tactics specifically designed to neutralize Byzantine advantages. Their infantry could match imperial forces in close combat. Their cavalry was equally skilled at both light harassment and heavy shock tactics, and they had mastered the art of siege warfare that allowed them to capture and hold fortified positions that the Byzantines considered impregnable. Most importantly, they fought with the desperate intensity of people defending their homeland against an empire that viewed their very existence as illegitimate. Standing in a Bulgarian fortress in 990 CE, you'd see defensive preparations that revealed the sophistication of their strategic thinking. These weren't simple wooden palisades. They were complex stone fortifications designed by engineers who understood both Byzantine siege techniques and the mountainous terrain of the Balkans. Every approach was covered by interlocking fields of fire. Every wall was designed to maximize the effectiveness of defender firepower, and every position could be resupplied and reinforced even during extended sieges. The fortress design also revealed Bulgarian understanding of Byzantine psychological warfare techniques. These defensive positions weren't just designed to resist military assault, they were designed to survive. The kind of prolonged siege warfare that the Byzantines used to break enemy morale. Food storage systems could support garrisons for months. Water supplies were protected against contamination or interdiction. And communication systems allowed defenders to coordinate with relief forces, even when completely surrounded. But Samuel's greatest innovation was psychological. He understood that defeating the Byzantine Empire required more than winning individual battles. It required convincing Byzantine subjects that imperial authority was not invincible. Bulgarian forces made a point of treating captured civilians well, while demonstrating that imperial armies could be defeated and imperial territory permanently occupied. This wasn't just conquest. It was a systematic campaign to undermine the psychological foundations of Byzantine power. The results were visible throughout the disputed territories. Local populations began to see Bulgarian rule as potentially permanent rather than temporary occupation. Byzantine tax collectors found themselves increasingly unwelcome. Imperial administrators discovered that their authority was being quietly ignored, and recruitment for imperial armies became difficult in regions where people had begun to identify more with Bulgarian than Byzantine interests. Bulgarian success also had broader implications for Byzantine strategic security. Samuel's victories had demonstrated that a Slavic state could successfully resist imperial conquest using methods that other potential enemies could replicate. This created the possibility of a cascade effect where successful Bulgarian resistance could inspire similar movements throughout the empire's Slavic territories, potentially fragmenting imperial control over vast regions that provided crucial agricultural and military resources. By 995 CE, you're watching a situation that any experienced Byzantine strategist would recognize as existentially dangerous. Bulgaria had demonstrated that it could not only resist imperial armies, but actively expand at imperial expense. More troubling, they had proven that a Slavic state could successfully adopt Byzantine governmental and military techniques while maintaining independence, potentially inspiring similar movements throughout the empire's Slavic territories. The sophistication of Bulgarian resistance had also forced the Byzantine Empire to devote enormous military and financial resources to a conflict that showed no signs of resolution through conventional means. Years of warfare had drained imperial treasuries, diverted forces that were needed to defend other frontiers, and created political pressures within the empire that threatened to destabilize imperial authority even if the Bulgarian campaign ultimately succeeded. This was exactly the kind of threat that Byzantine strategic doctrine was designed to eliminate through methods so brutal that no rational actor would ever attempt to replicate the challenge. The stage was being set for a demonstration of imperial power that would be remembered for centuries, and that would establish precedents for psychological warfare that would influence military thinking throughout the medieval world. The art of medieval psychological warfare. You're in the imperial war room in Constantinople in 1000 CE, surrounded by maps that show something terrifying from a Byzantine perspective, red markers indicating Bulgarian-controlled territory stretching deep into what the empire considered its core lands. But what you're really witnessing is the birth of a psychological warfare strategy so sophisticated and brutal that it would influence military thinking for centuries. Bazil II stands before these maps, now 34 years old and hardened by 2 decades of almost constant warfare. His pale features have taken on the gaunt intensity of a man who has learned to see human suffering as a tool to be wielded with the same precision as a sword or siege engine. What you're watching is the intellectual process that will lead to the systematic blinding of 15,000 prisoners. A mind that has concluded that traditional warfare is insufficient and that victory requires methods designed to break the enemy's will to resist permanently. The emperor's advisors surround him, but you notice something crucial about their body language. They're not debating whether to use extreme measures. They're discussing how to implement them most effectively. The Byzantine court had developed a culture where moral squeamishness was seen as a luxury the empire couldn't afford. These men had grown up hearing stories of imperial territories lost to enemies who showed no mercy, and they had concluded that survival required matching or exceeding enemy brutality. The walls around you are covered with detailed intelligence reports that reveal the scientific approach the Byzantines had developed towards psychological warfare. These aren't random collections of battlefield observations. They're systematic analyses of enemy psychology, social structure, and cultural values that could be exploited or weaponized. Imperial agents had spent years studying Bulgarian society, identifying exactly which types of punishment would have the maximum psychological impact on both immediate victims and the broader enemy population. Standing in that war room, you'd see evidence of consultation with scholars who had studied historical precedents for mass psychological warfare, military engineers who had calculated the logistics of implementing systematic torture on an industrial scale, and medical specialists who had developed techniques for maximizing survival rates among mutilated prisoners. This wasn't simple savagery. It was sophisticated strategic planning that treated human suffering as a resource to be managed with the same attention to detail that the empire applied to any other military asset. But this wasn't Byzantine innovation in isolation. The empire had developed its approach to psychological warfare through centuries of interaction with enemies who had demonstrated their own willingness to use extreme methods. Arab armies had shown that systematic destruction of civilian populations could break enemy resistance more effectively than traditional military campaigns. Slavic raiders had proven that terror tactics could force much larger imperial forces to abandon territories they couldn't effectively defend. And Bulgarian forces themselves had used strategic cruelty to undermine imperial authority in disputed regions. The discussions you'd overhear would reveal the sophistication of Byzantine strategic thinking. Officers debated optimal ratios of survivors to casualties that would maximize psychological impact, analyzed the most effective ways to ensure that news of imperial brutality spread throughout enemy territories, and calculated the long-term effects of different types of mutilation on enemy recruitment and morale. These conversations had the same methodical tone that modern military planners might use when discussing logistics or communication systems. The Byzantine approach to psychological warfare was also notable for its integration with diplomatic and economic strategies. The empire didn't just rely on military terror. It combined brutal examples with sophisticated propaganda campaigns designed to convince enemy populations that resistance was futile while submission would be rewarded. Imperial agents would spread carefully crafted stories about the fate of those who opposed imperial authority, while simultaneously offering generous terms to communities that submitted voluntarily. You need to understand that medieval warfare operated according to rules that modern people find almost incomprehensible. Mercy was often seen as weakness that encouraged further resistance, while calculated brutality was viewed as a humanitarian tool that could prevent longer, more destructive conflicts. From a Byzantine perspective, the systematic torture of prisoners wasn't cruelty. It was efficient statecraft designed to save lives by ending enemy resistance permanently, rather than allowing conflicts to drag on for decades. The empire had also developed sophisticated methods for publicizing its acts of psychological warfare. Imperial propagandists understood that the effectiveness of terror tactics depended heavily on ensuring that news of them spread quickly and accurately throughout enemy territories. They maintained networks of agents whose job was to spread carefully crafted accounts of imperial brutality, emphasizing both its inevitability and its precision. These propaganda campaigns were designed to convince potential enemies that resistance was not only futile, but would lead to fates worse than death. The war room itself was designed to support this kind of strategic thinking. You'd see detailed maps that showed not just military positions but population centers, trade routes, and communication networks that could be used to spread psychological warfare throughout enemy territories. Intelligence files contained detailed profiles of enemy leaders, analyses of their psychological vulnerabilities, and recommendations for specific types of torture or humiliation that would have the maximum impact on their followers. By 1005 CE, you're watching the final preparations for a campaign that will demonstrate Byzantine psychological warfare at its most methodical. The emperor has spent years studying Bulgarian society, identifying exactly which types of punishment would have the maximum psychological impact, and developing logistical systems capable of implementing mass mutilation with industrial efficiency. This wasn't random violence. It was the culmination of decades of strategic planning designed to permanently eliminate an existential threat to imperial survival. Standing in the imperial armory, you'd see equipment being prepared that reveals the calculated nature of what's coming. Special knives designed specifically for eye removal, medical supplies for preventing fatal infections that would reduce the number of survivors who could spread terror, and detailed organizational charts for managing the systematic mutilation of thousands of prisoners with the same precision used for large-scale construction projects. The sophistication of Byzantine psychological warfare planning also extended to post-conflict considerations. Imperial strategists had calculated exactly how many mutilated survivors would be needed to maximize terror throughout Bulgarian territories, how long it would take for news of mass mutilation to spread throughout enemy population centers, and what kinds of follow-up diplomatic initiatives would be most effective for converting psychological shock into permanent political submission. This wasn't sadism. It was the logical culmination of centuries of imperial strategic thinking that had concluded traditional warfare was insufficient for permanently eliminating existential threats. The systematic blinding of 15,000 prisoners was just one element in a comprehensive strategy designed to break Bulgarian society so completely that no future generation would ever again challenge Byzantine supremacy. The campaign that built to horror. You're marching with Basil II's army through the Struma Valley in 1013 CE. And what you're experiencing is military efficiency on a scale that would have impressed Caesar himself. This isn't a medieval horde stumbling toward battle. This, a precisely organized war machine designed to implement systematic destruction with industrial precision. The emperor has spent 8 years preparing for this campaign, and every detail has been calculated to maximize both military effectiveness and psychological impact. The army around you represents the pinnacle of Byzantine military evolution, a force that combines the organizational genius of classical Rome with tactical innovations learned through centuries of warfare against enemies from every corner of the known world. You'd see units that reflect influences from across the medieval landscape. Varangian guardsmen, whose axes could split a man from skull to sternum. Armenian cavalry, whose composite bows could drop enemy soldiers at ranges that seemed almost magical. And Greek fire specialists, who carried the empire's most closely guarded military secrets. But what makes this force truly terrifying isn't its diversity. It's its absolute discipline and the methodical way it approaches warfare. Walking through the camp at any hour, you'd witness something that would chill any enemy observer. The complete absence of chaos or uncertainty. Every soldier knows exactly what his role will be in the coming battle. Every officer has memorized detailed contingency plans that account for dozens of possible battlefield scenarios. And everyone understands that failure to execute orders precisely will result in punishment that makes enemy torture seem merciful. The logistics of this campaign would impress modern military planners. You'd see supply trains that stretch for miles, carrying not just food and weapons, but specialized equipment designed specifically for the systematic torture of prisoners. Medical corps equipped with surgical instruments that won't be seen again in Europe for centuries. Administrative units whose job is to document every aspect of the campaign for future strategic analysis. And intelligence specialists who maintain detailed files on Bulgarian leadership, population centers, and psychological vulnerabilities that can be exploited during the post-battle phase. The Byzantine Empire approached warfare as a science, and this campaign represents the application of centuries of accumulated military knowledge combined with innovations, specifically designed for the permanent elimination of the Bulgarian threat. You'd see evidence of this scientific approach in everything from the mathematical precision with which units are positioned, to the detailed contingency plans that account for every possible Bulgarian tactical response, to the careful coordination between military operations and the psychological warfare campaign that will follow victory. But what makes this particular campaign unique is its explicit goal, not just defeating the Bulgarian army, but permanently destroying Bulgaria's capacity for independent resistance. Basil II has concluded that traditional conquest isn't sufficient. He needs to break Bulgarian society so thoroughly that no future generation will ever again challenge Byzantine supremacy. The systematic blinding of 15,000 prisoners is just one element in a comprehensive strategy designed to make Bulgarian independence literally unthinkable. You're now witnessing the siege of Bulgarian fortresses, and what you'd see would reveal the systematic nature of imperial strategy. These aren't chaotic assaults driven by bloodlust. They're carefully orchestrated operations designed to minimize Byzantine casualties while maximizing the psychological impact on Bulgarian defenders. Every siege follows the same methodical pattern. Overwhelming force concentrated at precisely calculated points, minimal mercy for resistors, and calculated demonstrations of what happens to those who refuse to surrender immediately. The siege techniques themselves reveal the sophistication of Byzantine military engineering. You'd see siege engines that represent the pinnacle of medieval technology, coordinated with assault tactics that have been refined through decades of experience against fortifications throughout the known world. But more importantly, you'd notice that every aspect of the siege is designed not just to capture the immediate objective, but to create examples that will influence the behavior of other Bulgarian strongholds throughout the campaign. The emperor himself moves through the campaign with the focused intensity of a man implementing a long-planned design. You'd notice that he personally reviews intelligence reports about Bulgarian morale, approves specific techniques for interrogating prisoners, and makes detailed notes about which psychological warfare tactics prove most effective against different types of enemy resistance. This isn't a ruler swept up in the passion of conquest. This is a strategist methodically implementing a plan that he's been developing for over a decade. Basil's approach to command reveals the calculating mind that will eventually order the systematic mutilation of 15,000 prisoners. He treats every captured fortress, every interrogated prisoner, and every piece of intelligence as data points in a larger strategic analysis designed to identify the most effective methods for permanently breaking Bulgarian resistance. You'd see him studying detailed reports about the psychological effects of different types of punishment on captured soldiers, the most effective ratios of killed to mutilated prisoners for maximizing terror among enemy populations, and the optimal methods for ensuring that news of imperial brutality spreads throughout Bulgarian territories. The Army's medical corps has been expanded specifically for this campaign, but not primarily to treat Byzantine casualties. Imperial medical officers have spent months developing techniques for mass mutilation that maximize survival rates while ensuring permanent disability. These men carry specialized instruments designed for eye removal, detailed protocols for preventing fatal infections that would reduce the number of survivors who can spread terror, and organizational systems for processing thousands of prisoners with the same efficiency used for managing supply logistics. Standing outside the fortress of Cleidion in July 1014, you'd see the final preparations for what will become one of history's most systematically brutal acts. The Byzantine army has surrounded the fortress with mathematical precision, cutting off every possible escape route and establishing supply lines that can maintain the siege indefinitely. But more importantly, you'd see the preparation of equipment and personnel specifically designed for the mass mutilation of prisoners that will follow victory. The soldiers selected for the post-battle operations aren't random volunteers. They're specialists who have been trained in techniques for systematic torture that serve strategic rather than sadistic purposes. Imperial administrators have calculated exactly how many prisoners can be processed per hour, how to prevent fatal complications that would reduce the number of survivors, and how to organize the entire operation so that the maximum number of Bulgarian witnesses will survive to spread terror throughout enemy territories. The siege of Cleidion itself represents everything that makes Byzantine military doctrine so effective and so terrifying. You'd see an army that approaches fortress reduction with the same methodical precision that modern corporations might apply to manufacturing processes. Every aspect of the operation has been planned to serve multiple strategic purposes: military defeat of immediate resistance, capture of the maximum number of prisoners for psychological warfare purposes, and demonstration of imperial power that will influence the behavior of other Bulgarian strongholds throughout the region. What you're witnessing is the final stage of a campaign that represents Byzantine strategic thinking at its most sophisticated and brutal. Every element has been designed to serve the ultimate goal of permanently eliminating the Bulgarian threat through methods so systematic and horrifying that no future generation will ever again challenge imperial authority. The stage is set for an act of calculated cruelty that will echo through history and establish precedents for psychological warfare that will influence military thinking for centuries. The Battle of Cleidion, July 29th, 1014. You're standing on a hillside overlooking the Belasitsa Mountains at dawn on July 29th, 1014. And what you're about to witness will be remembered as one of the most decisive and brutal battles in medieval history. The morning mist clings to the valley floor, where two armies that represent fundamentally different visions of European civilization are about to collide in a battle that will determine whether the Byzantine Empire continues to exist or fragments into competing Slavic kingdoms. The Bulgarian army below you numbers approximately 15,000 men, and they're positioned in what should be an impregnable defensive position. Samuel of Bulgaria has chosen his ground carefully. His forces occupy a narrow pass between steep mountains, with their flanks protected by terrain that should make Byzantine cavalry charges impossible. These aren't desperate barbarians making a last stand. They're professional soldiers fighting for the independence of a sophisticated state that has successfully resisted Byzantine conquest for over 2 centuries. The Bulgarian battle line reveals the military sophistication that has made them such dangerous enemies. You see infantry formations that mirror Byzantine tactical organization, cavalry units equipped with weapons and armor that match imperial standards, and defensive positions that demonstrate a thorough understanding of how to maximize the advantages of mountainous terrain. These soldiers know they're fighting for more than just military victory. They're defending a way of life and a national identity that the Byzantine Empire considers an illegitimate challenge to imperial authority. But watching the Byzantine forces deploy, you'd realize that Samuel has made a crucial miscalculation. Basil II hasn't brought just an army. He's brought a military machine, specifically designed to overcome the exact type of defensive position that the Bulgarians have chosen. Imperial engineers have spent months studying the terrain around Cleidion, identifying weaknesses in positions that appear impregnable, and developing tactics that exploit the arrogance of enemies who believe that geography alone can defeat Byzantine organizational superiority. The Byzantine deployment reveals military thinking that operates on a completely different level from traditional medieval warfare. You'd see coordinated movements between units separated by miles of difficult terrain, siege equipment positioned to support attacks that won't begin for hours, and supply systems that can maintain complex military operations indefinitely. This isn't just an army preparing for battle. It's a sophisticated military system implementing a predetermined plan designed to achieve specific strategic objectives with maximum efficiency. The battle begins at dawn with something that immediately reveals the sophistication of Byzantine planning, a coordinated assault that appears to be a frontal attack, but is actually designed to hold Bulgarian attention while imperial forces implement a flanking maneuver so complex that it requires precise timing between units operating in completely different geographical areas. You're watching military choreography that represents the culmination of centuries of imperial tactical evolution. The sound that fills the valley is unlike anything in your previous experience. Not just the clash of weapons and shouting of men, but the methodical rhythm of an army that fights according to predetermined patterns. Byzantine units advance, withdraw, and reposition according to plans that were developed months in advance, while Bulgarian forces find themselves constantly reacting to moves they didn't anticipate and can't counter effectively. What makes this battle particularly horrifying isn't just its violence, but its predetermined outcome. Standing on that hillside, you gradually realize that the Bulgarian army isn't fighting a battle. It's being systematically destroyed by forces that are implementing a plan designed to maximize both military effectiveness and psychological impact. Every Byzantine tactical decision serves multiple purposes: defeating immediate resistance, minimizing imperial casualties, and creating conditions that will allow for the maximum psychological exploitation of victory. The complexity of Byzantine tactical coordination would impress modern military analysts. You'd see cavalry charges timed to coincide with infantry assaults launched from completely different directions, artillery bombardments that support maneuvers by units that are miles away from the siege engines, and communication systems that allow commanders to coordinate complex operations across terrain that should make such coordination impossible. Bulgarian resistance, while fierce, reveals the fundamental disadvantage of fighting an enemy that has spent decades preparing for this specific engagement. Samuel's forces fight with the desperate courage of men defending their homeland, but their tactics are reactive rather than proactive, responding to Byzantine initiatives rather than implementing their own strategic plan. They're brave, competent soldiers fighting according to established military principles, but they're facing an enemy that has developed tactical innovations specifically designed to neutralize traditional defensive advantages. By midday, you're watching the collapse of Bulgarian resistance. But what happens next reveals the true genius of Basil II's strategic thinking. Instead of allowing defeated enemies to scatter and potentially regroup, Imperial forces have positioned themselves to capture the maximum number of prisoners while preventing any significant Bulgarian forces from escaping to continue resistance elsewhere. This isn't just victory. It's the systematic dismantling of an enemy state's capacity for future military action. The efficiency with which 15,000 Bulgarian soldiers are captured would impress modern military planners. Imperial units sweep through the battlefield with the precision of a harvesting operation, separating the dead from the wounded, identifying officers who might possess valuable intelligence, and organizing prisoners into groups that will facilitate the mass mutilation that Basil has planned as the culmination of this campaign. The battlefield itself becomes a laboratory for the systematic application of psychological warfare, principles that the Byzantines have been developing for decades. You'd see imperial officers evaluating prisoners not just for immediate intelligence value, but for their potential effectiveness as instruments of terror when they're returned to Bulgarian territories. Administrative personnel maintain detailed records of each prisoner's home region, military unit, and social connections, ensuring that their eventual fate will have the maximum psychological impact on specific Bulgarian communities. Standing among the captured Bulgarians that evening, you'd see something that would haunt anyone with normal human sensibilities. Men who hours ago were proud soldiers defending their homeland, now reduced to raw material for an act of psychological warfare so systematic that it requires industrial-level organization. These aren't criminals being punished for specific crimes. They're symbols being prepared for transformation into instruments of imperial propaganda. The Byzantine army that evening operates with the mechanical efficiency of men implementing a predetermined plan that extends far beyond the immediate military victory. You'd see medical officers preparing instruments for mass eye removal, administrative personnel organizing prisoners into groups that will maximize the psychological impact of what's coming, and guards who treat their captives with the impersonal professionalism of workers handling inventory in a warehouse. The organization of the prisoner processing reveals the sophisticated planning that went into this campaign. Imperial administrators have developed systems for managing thousands of captives that account for everything from food and medical care to waste disposal and crowd control. But the ultimate purpose of this organizational efficiency isn't humanitarian. It's designed to ensure that the maximum number of prisoners survive to serve as living advertisements for imperial power when they're returned to Bulgarian territories. What you're witnessing is the final preparation for an act that will define the meaning of imperial power for generations. The Battle of Kleidion hasn't just ended Bulgarian military resistance. It's created the conditions for a demonstration of Byzantine ruthlessness that will be remembered long after the specific political circumstances that produced it have been forgotten. The stage is set for systematic brutality that will transform 15,000 soldiers into instruments of psychological warfare, designed to prevent future challenges to imperial authority. Systematic horror begins in the Byzantine camp on the morning of July 30th, 1014, and what you're witnessing would traumatize anyone unprepared for the industrial efficiency with which empires can implement mass mutilation. The 15,000 Bulgarian prisoners have been organized into groups of 100, with imperial administrators maintaining detailed records of each group's composition, origin, and intended fate. This isn't random brutality driven by battlefield passion. This is systematic torture, implemented with the same methodical precision that the Empire applies to tax collection or road construction. The morning air carries sounds that would haunt you for the rest of your life. Not screams of pain, which you might expect, but the methodical sounds of organized activity. You hear the sharpening of knives, specifically designed for eye removal. The preparation of medical supplies intended to keep victims alive long enough to serve as examples. And the quiet conversations of men who discuss mass mutilation with the same professional tone that farmers might use when planning a harvest. Walking through the camp, you'd see the bureaucratic infrastructure that makes systematic torture possible. Imperial scribes maintain detailed records of each prisoner's name, home village, and military unit, ensuring that news of their fate will reach the maximum number of people throughout Bulgarian territories. Administrative officers coordinate the logistics of feeding, guarding, and processing thousands of prisoners with the efficiency of men who have reduced human suffering to a series of solvable logistical problems. The organization reveals planning that extends far beyond the immediate battlefield victory. You'd see evidence of months of preparation for this moment. Specialized medical equipment that has been manufactured specifically for mass eye removal. Administrative systems that can process thousands of prisoners with the same efficiency used for managing imperial taxation, and supply chains that can support industrial-scale torture while maintaining the health of victims long enough to maxim. Eyes their value as psychological warfare instruments. But what makes this scene particularly horrifying is the complete absence of sadistic pleasure among the imperial soldiers. These aren't men who enjoy inflicting pain. They're professionals implementing imperial policy with the same dutiful competence they would bring to any other military assignment. The systematic nature of what they're doing is revealed in their casual efficiency. They've organized mass mutilation as if it were a construction project, with specialized roles, quality control measures, and productivity targets. You need to understand the psychological sophistication of what Basil II has planned. The blinding of 15,000 prisoners isn't designed just to punish Bulgarian resistance. It's calculated to create a demonstration of imperial power that will prevent future resistance by making the costs of challenging Byzantine authority literally unthinkable. Every detail has been planned to maximize the psychological impact on both immediate victims and the broader Bulgarian population. The process begins with a level of organization that would impress modern administrators. Prisoners are processed in groups of 100, with 99 men being completely blinded and one left with a single eye to guide his companions home. This isn't arbitrary cruelty. It's a carefully calculated ratio designed to ensure that news of imperial brutality spreads throughout Bulgarian territories, while minimizing the number of witnesses who might rally future resistance. The mathematical precision of this ratio reveals the sophisticated strategic thinking behind what appears to be simple sadism. Imperial strategists have calculated that 1 guide per 100 prisoners represents the optimal balance between ensuring that news of mass mutilation reaches Bulgarian population centers while minimizing the number of intact witnesses who might serve as leaders for future resistance movements. This is psychological warfare reduced to an exact science. Standing near the area where the mutilations are taking place, you'd see medical officers who have clearly spent considerable time developing techniques for eye removal that maximize survival rates while ensuring permanent disability. These men use specialized instruments, follow standardized procedures, and monitor victims for signs of potentially fatal complications. The goal isn't to kill. It's to create living advertisements for imperial power who will spend the rest of their lives demonstrating what happens to those who challenge Byzantine authority. The medical sophistication of the operation would shock anyone familiar with medieval healthcare. Imperial physicians have developed surgical techniques that won't be seen again in Europe for centuries, designed specifically to ensure that victims survive the mutilation process while suffering maximum psychological trauma. They've calculated optimal methods for preventing fatal infections, techniques for minimizing blood loss that could lead to death, and procedures for ensuring that victims remain conscious throughout the process to maximize the psychological impact of their torture. The efficiency of the operation would shock anyone familiar with medieval logistics. Imperial forces process approximately 1,000 prisoners per day, maintaining quality control standards that ensure consistent results while minimizing fatalities that would reduce the psychological impact of the demonstration. Support personnel manage everything from waste disposal to crowd control with the competence of experienced administrators handling a routine imperial function. The administrative system supporting this mass torture revealed a bureaucratic sophistication that makes industrial-scale cruelty possible. You'd see detailed scheduling systems that ensure optimal utilization of personnel and equipment, quality control measures that maintain consistent standards across thousands of individual procedures, and record-keeping systems that track every victim to ensure that news of their fate reaches the appropriate Bulgarian communities. What makes this systematic torture particularly effective as psychological warfare is its precision. The Byzantines aren't randomly brutalizing enemies. They're implementing a carefully designed program intended to break Bulgarian society's capacity for resistance, while demonstrating imperial power to potential future threats throughout the known world. Every blinded prisoner becomes a walking testament to the futility of challenging imperial authority. The psychological sophistication of the operation extends to the treatment of the prisoners themselves. Imperial guards maintain discipline among the captives, not through random violence, but through calculated demonstrations of what happens to those who resist the mutilation process. The message is clear. Cooperation leads to survival, while resistance leads to death. This isn't just torture. It's a comprehensive system for breaking human will through the precise application of physical and psychological pressure. By the third day, you're watching the final stages of an operation that represents psychological warfare at its most methodical. 15,000 Bulgarian soldiers have been transformed into instruments of imperial propaganda, living symbols of what happens to those who dare to challenge Byzantine supremacy. The precision with which this has been accomplished reveals an empire that has reduced human suffering to a science in service of political objectives that transcend normal moral considerations. The completion of this systematic mutilation marks more than just the end of a military campaign. It represents the successful implementation of psychological warfare techniques that will influence imperial policy for centuries and establish precedents for the relationship between state power and individual, suffering that will echo throughout medieval European history. The March of the Blinded, a living nightmare. You're following the most horrifying procession in medieval history as 15,000 blinded Bulgarian prisoners begin their journey home in August 1014. What you're witnessing isn't just the aftermath of a single battle, but the implementation of psychological warfare so sophisticated that it will influence military thinking for centuries. The sight before you would break the mind of anyone unprepared for the systematic brutality that empires can inflict when they decide that normal moral constraints are obstacles to survival. The organization of this procession reveals the methodical nature of Byzantine psychological warfare in ways that would be almost admirable if they weren't so horrifying. Every 100 blinded men is led by a single prisoner left with one eye, creating a chain of human misery that stretches for miles across the Bulgarian countryside. These aren't random groups of disabled veterans. They're carefully organized instruments of imperial propaganda, living advertisements for Byzantine power that will traumatize every person who sees them and spread terror throughout territories that have dared to resist imperial authority. Walking alongside this procession, you'd hear sounds that no human should ever have to experience. Not just the moans of men in physical pain, but the deeper psychological anguish of soldiers who have been transformed from proud defenders of their homeland into symbols of their nation's defeat. They weep constantly, not just from the pain of their wounds, but from the knowledge that they have become weapons in the enemy's psychological arsenal. Living proof that resistance to imperial power leads only to suffering beyond imagination. The physical organization of the march reveals planning that extends far beyond immediate military considerations. Imperial supply units provide just enough food and medical care to keep the maximum number of prisoners alive for the journey home, while Byzantine administrators maintain detailed records of the procession's route to ensure that news of imperial brutality reaches every significant Bulgarian population center. This isn't charity. It's strategic investment in psychological warfare designed to break enemy morale permanently. You'd notice that the route chosen for this march of horror has been planned with the same attention to detail that the Empire applies to major military campaigns. The procession doesn't take the most direct path to Bulgarian territories. Instead, it follows roads that will maximize the psychological impact on civilian populations. Every village, every market town, every religious center along the route will witness the systematic mutilation of 15,000 soldiers, creating a wave of terror that will spread throughout Bulgarian society and convince entire populations that resistance to imperial authority is futile. The logistics of managing 15,000 disabled prisoners reveals the sophisticated planning behind this act of calculated cruelty. Imperial medical officers travel with the procession, providing just enough care to prevent deaths that would reduce the psychological impact while ensuring that survivors remain visibly mutilated examples of imperial power. Administrative personnel maintain detailed records of deaths, escapes, and the psychological reactions of civilian populations who encounter the procession, treating human suffering as data points in a comprehensive analysis of psychological warfare effectiveness. But what makes this procession particularly effective as psychological warfare is its targeting of specific cultural and military values that define Bulgarian national identity. The Bulgarians had built their sense of nationhood around concepts of military honor and the protection of homeland territories. By systematically mutilating captured soldiers while keeping them alive to serve as examples, the Byzantines have created a demonstration that directly contradicts every foundational myth of Bulgarian military culture. The psychological impact on Bulgarian civilians who encounter this procession goes far beyond normal human sympathy for suffering. You see women who collapse in horror at the sight of mutilated soldiers, men who immediately begin making plans to submit to imperial authority rather than risk similar fates, and children who will grow up with permanent memories of what happens to those who challenge Byzantine power. This isn't just a military defeat. It's a comprehensive assault on the psychological foundations of Bulgarian resistance. The march takes weeks, and what you'd observe during this time reveals the long-term strategic thinking behind the emperor's decision. As news of the procession spreads throughout Bulgarian territories, you see the collapse of popular support for continued resistance that goes far beyond anything that could be achieved through traditional military campaigns. Local officials begin quietly negotiating with Byzantine administrators. Military recruiters find that young men no longer volunteer for service, and the infrastructure of organized resistance begins to fragment as people conclude that submission is preferable to the fate demonstrated by these 15,000 living symbols of defeat. The precision with which this psychological warfare campaign has been implemented would impress modern military strategists. The Byzantines haven't just defeated an enemy army. They've created a self-sustaining propaganda system that will continue to undermine Bulgarian resistance for decades. Every person who sees these blinded prisoners becomes an unwilling participant in spreading imperial terror throughout enemy territories, creating a multiplication effect that extends the psychological impact far beyond the immediate victims. Standing in Bulgarian villages as this procession passes, you'd witness the complete collapse of civilian morale that accompanies the sight of 15,000 mutilated soldiers. Women weep not just for the individual victims, but for the clear demonstration that their sons and husbands face fates worse than death if they continue to resist imperial authority. Men who might have volunteered for military service look at these living symbols of defeat and conclude that submission offers the only hope for preserving their families and communities. The procession also serves as a traveling advertisement for imperial mercy, or rather, for the empire's definition of mercy. Byzantine officials who accompany the march make sure that local populations understand that the prisoners have been allowed to live, that they've been provided with guides to help them return home, and that their mutilation represents imperial restraint rather than imperial cruelty. The message is clear. This is what happens to enemies who are fortunate enough to survive challenging imperial authority. The psychological sophistication of this campaign extends to its treatment of Bulgarian religious and cultural institutions. The procession deliberately passes through areas with significant religious or cultural importance, ensuring that the sight of mutilated soldiers becomes associated with the most sacred aspects of Bulgarian identity. Churches that might have served as centers for organizing resistance become monuments to the futility of challenging imperial power, and cultural celebrations become occasions for remembering the costs of military defeat. By the time this procession reaches Bulgarian territories still controlled by Samuel's remaining forces, you're watching the implementation of psychological warfare so effective that it eliminates enemy resistance without requiring additional military campaigns. The sight of 15,000 blinded soldiers has accomplished what years of traditional warfare could not: the complete destruction of Bulgarian confidence in their ability to resist imperial power. The March of the Blinded represents more than just the aftermath of a military victory. It's the successful transformation of human suffering into a strategic weapon that will continue to serve imperial interests for generations. These men have become living symbols of imperial power, walking advertisements for the consequences of challenging Byzantine authority, and permanent reminders that resistance to the empire leads inevitably to fates worse than death. The empire's calculated mercy and Samuel's collapse. You're in Prespa, Samuel of Bulgaria's final stronghold, in October 1014, and what you're witnessing is the psychological destruction of a ruler and a nation. Samuel stands before a window overlooking the lake that has given this fortress its name, but his attention isn't focused on the picturesque landscape. It's fixed on the procession of his blinded soldiers as they make their way toward the city gates. What you're seeing is the moment when a king realizes that his kingdom has been destroyed not through military defeat alone, but through an act of calculated psychological warfare so brutal that it has shattered his people's will to resist. The emperor, who had spent 40 years building Bulgarian independence into a genuine threat to Byzantine survival, is now a broken man, aged decades in the months since the Battle of Cledion. His hair has gone completely white. His hands shake when he tries to read military reports, and his voice carries the hollow tone of someone who has been forced to watch his life's work systematically destroyed through methods that challenge every assumption about medieval warfare and political leadership. Walking through Prespa's halls, you'd see the infrastructure of a collapsing state that reveals how effectively psychological warfare can accomplish what decades of traditional military campaigns could not. Ministers who once debated strategy for resisting Byzantine expansion now spend their time negotiating terms of surrender. Military commanders struggle to find recruits willing to face the fate demonstrated by their blinded comrades, and administrative officials quietly prepare for the transition to imperial rule while maintaining the pretense that Bulgarian independence might somehow survive. The reports reaching Samuel from throughout Bulgarian territories reveal the systematic nature of the psychological collapse that the empire has engineered through the strategic use of mass mutilation. Village after village has sent delegations to Byzantine administrators, offering submission in exchange for protection from the fate suffered by the army at Cledion. Military recruiters report that young men who might have volunteered to defend their homeland now refuse to take up arms. Terrified that capture will lead to mutilation that makes death seem preferable to survival. You need to understand what this means in the context of medieval political psychology and the role that military honor played in maintaining royal authority. Samuel's kingdom hadn't been built through conquest alone. It had been sustained by the belief that Bulgarian independence was both possible and worth the cost of defending it. The systematic blinding of 15,000 prisoners has destroyed that belief more effectively than any military campaign, creating a situation where continued resistance seems not just difficult, but literally unthinkable to the average Bulgarian civilian. The psychological sophistication of the Byzantine strategy becomes clear when you examine the specific ways in which the blinded prisoners have been used to undermine Bulgarian military culture. These men aren't just disabled veterans returning from an unsuccessful campaign. They're living contradictions of everything the Bulgarian military tradition represents. Warriors who were supposed to die gloriously in defense of their homeland have instead been transformed into permanent symbols of defeat, humiliation, and the futility of resistance to imperial power. Standing in the throne room as Samuel receives his final military reports, you'd witness the complete collapse of a ruler who has been forced to watch his kingdom destroyed through methods that challenge every assumption about medieval statecraft and the relationship between military defeat and political surrender. These reports detail not military defeats, but psychological surrender. Entire regions submitting to imperial authority without fighting, fortresses opening their gates rather than risk the fate of Cledian's garrison, and military units disbanding as soldiers conclude that service leads only to mutilation or death. The emperor's physical collapse follows quickly after the psychological destruction of his kingdom. And what you're witnessing reveals the personal cost of challenging an empire that has decided normal moral constraints are obstacles to survival. Within weeks of seeing his blinded soldiers return home, Samuel suffers what medieval chroniclers describe as a stroke, brought on by grief and shock and witnessing the systematic destruction of everything he had spent his life building. Modern historians might diagnose Samuel's condition differently, but the result is the same: the complete incapacitation of the only leader capable of organizing continued Bulgarian resistance to imperial authority. The sight of 15,000 mutilated soldiers has accomplished something that decades of traditional warfare could not: the psychological destruction of enemy leadership through the systematic application of terror, tactics designed to break the will of individuals who might otherwise continue to organize resistance. What makes Samuel's collapse particularly tragic is the sophistication of the psychological warfare that has been deployed against him personally. The Byzantines haven't just defeated his armies. They've created a demonstration so horrifying that it has convinced his own people that he lacks the power to protect them from fates worse than death. Every blinded soldier who returns home becomes a living argument against continued resistance, a walking advertisement for the emperor's own failure as a military leader and protector of his people. The political implications of Samuel's psychological collapse extend far beyond his personal fate. Bulgarian nobility who had supported independence begin making private overtures to Byzantine administrators. Regional commanders start negotiating terms for switching sides, and the entire governmental structure that had sustained Bulgarian resistance for decades begins to fragment as people conclude that continued defiance will only lead to systematic torture for anyone unfortunate enough to be captured by imperial forces. You're witnessing the culmination of Basil II's strategic genius in ways that go far beyond simple military victory. The blinding of 15,000 prisoners wasn't just punishment for military resistance. It was a carefully calculated act designed to break enemy morale so completely that future resistance becomes psychologically impossible for both leadership and civilian populations. The sight of mutilated soldiers has convinced an entire nation that submission is preferable to the alternative, eliminating the need for costly military campaigns that might have taken decades to achieve the same result. The reports reaching Samuel also reveal the broader implications of Byzantine psychological warfare for the balance of power throughout southeastern Europe. Other Slavic kingdoms have observed the fate of Bulgarian resistance and begun making preemptive overtures to imperial authorities, preferring negotiated submission to the risk of facing similar systematic torture if they're defeated in battle. The blinding of 15,000 prisoners has created a demonstration effect that extends far beyond the immediate Bulgarian territories, influencing the behavior of potential enemies throughout the region. By December 1014, you're watching the formal end of Bulgarian independence as imperial administrators take control of territories that have submitted voluntarily rather than face the fate demonstrated at Kleidion. The systematic torture of captured soldiers has accomplished something that traditional conquest never could: the complete psychological submission of an enemy population that now sees imperial rule as preferable to the alternative of continued resistance and the torture that inevitably follows military defeat. Samuel's death in early 1015 represents not just the end of a ruler, but the successful completion of a psychological warfare campaign that has permanently altered the balance of power in southeastern Europe through methods so brutal that they will be remembered for centuries. The emperor, who had challenged Byzantine supremacy for 40 years, dies knowing that his kingdom has been destroyed not through military defeat alone, but through the systematic application of terror that has made continued resistance literally unthinkable for his surviving subjects. The legacy of Samuel's collapse demonstrates the effectiveness of psychological warfare as a tool of imperial policy that can accomplish strategic objectives impossible to achieve through traditional military means. The sight of 15,000 blinded prisoners has proven more effective than decades of conventional warfare in eliminating the Bulgarian threat and establishing Byzantine dominance throughout the region. The legacy of systematic terror, how 15,000 eyes changed medieval warfare. You're standing in Constantinople in 1025 CE, 11 years after the blinding of 15,000 Bulgarian prisoners. And what you're witnessing is an empire that has been fundamentally transformed by the success of systematic psychological warfare. The city around you bustles with the confidence of a state that has eliminated its most dangerous enemy, not through decades of costly military campaigns, but through a single act of calculated brutality, so effective that it has redefined what imperial power means in the medieval world. Walking through the palace corridors, you'd overhear conversations that reveal how completely the empire's strategic thinking has been shaped by the success at Kleidion. Military planners now routinely discuss optimal ratios of killed to mutilated prisoners that will maximize psychological impact on enemy populations. Diplomatic negotiations include explicit threats of systematic torture designed to prevent conflicts before they begin. And imperial administrators maintain detailed databases of psychological warfare techniques that have proven effective against different types of enemies and different cultural contexts. The transformation isn't limited to military strategy. Throughout the empire, you'd see the infrastructure of a state that has learned to use terror as a routine tool of governance rather than an exceptional measure reserved for extreme circumstances. Provincial administrators report on the psychological effects of public executions with the same methodical attention to detail they apply to tax collection. Local commanders receive training in techniques for mass mutilation that ensure maximum survival rates among victims. And imperial propagandists have developed sophisticated methods for publicizing acts of state brutality to maximize their deterrent effects on potential future threats. But what makes this transformation particularly significant is its influence on medieval warfare throughout Europe and beyond. Standing in the imperial library, you'd see diplomatic correspondence from rulers across the known world requesting details about Byzantine psychological warfare techniques, military manuals that analyze the strategic effectiveness of systematic prisoner mutilation, and intelligence reports about enemy states that have begun implementing similar tactics in their own conflicts with neighboring kin. The success of Basil II's campaign has fundamentally altered how medieval rulers think about the relationship between cruelty and statecraft throughout the civilized world. What was once considered exceptional brutality, driven by individual sadism, has been revealed as a sophisticated tool of strategic policy that can accomplish political objectives impossible to achieve through traditional military means. The systematic blinding of 15,000 prisoners has become a case study in effective governance that influences royal courts from England to the Holy Land, from the emerging kingdoms of Eastern Europe to the established powers of the Mediterranean world. You need to understand the broader historical significance of what happened at Cledion in ways that extend far beyond the immediate collapse of Bulgarian resistance. This wasn't just a single act of medieval brutality. It was a demonstration that psychological warfare could be more effective than traditional military campaigns in achieving long-term strategic objectives that had seemed impossible through conventional means. The complete collapse of Bulgarian resistance following the mass mutilation of captured soldiers has proven that properly implemented terror can eliminate enemies more efficiently than conquest, occupation, or negotiated settlement. The Empire's diplomatic correspondence reveals how completely this lesson has been absorbed by imperial strategists and how it has transformed Byzantine approaches to international relations throughout the known world. Byzantine negotiators now routinely reference the fate of Bulgarian prisoners when dealing with potential enemies, using the memory of systematic mutilation as a bargaining chip that often eliminates the need for actual military action. The psychological impact of what happened at Cledion has become a weapon in itself, allowing the empire to achieve through reputation what might otherwise require costly campaigns that could drain imperial resources for decades. Standing in the throne room where Basil II received foreign ambassadors, you'd witness the practical application of terror as diplomatic policy in ways that reveal how completely the blinding of 15,000 prisoners has transformed the empire's relationship with the medieval world. Rulers who might have considered challenging imperial interests now submit to Byzantine demands rather than risk the fate demonstrated by the Bulgarian army. The emperor has created a form of power that transcends immediate military capabilities, establishing imperial authority through the memory of systematic brutality that continues to influence enemy behavior years after the original act. The long-term consequences extend far beyond the immediate collapse of Bulgarian resistance and have influenced the development of medieval warfare throughout Europe in ways that will shape military thinking for centuries. Throughout the medieval world, rulers have begun to understand that strategic cruelty can be more effective than traditional military virtues in achieving political objectives that seemed impossible through conventional means. The systematic torture of prisoners is no longer seen as a violation of military honor, but as a legitimate tool of statecraft that demonstrates sophistication rather than savagery. The influence of Byzantine psychological warfare techniques can be seen in conflicts throughout medieval Europe, where rulers have begun implementing similar strategies designed to break enemy morale through systematic terror rather than relying solely on traditional military victories. The precedent established at Cledion has created a new category of military thinking that treats human suffering as a strategic resource to be managed with the same attention to detail that medieval administrators apply to any other aspect of statecraft. By 1025 CE, you're witnessing the culmination of a transformation that began with the decision to blind 15,000 prisoners and has fundamentally altered the relationship between state power and individual suffering throughout the medieval world. The Byzantine Empire has become the model for how psychological warfare can be integrated into comprehensive strategic policy, influencing military thinking throughout Europe, and establishing precedents that will shape the conduct of medieval warfare for centuries to come. The legacy of that single day in 1014 CE continues to shape the medieval world in ways that extend far beyond the immediate. Military and political consequences of Bulgarian collapse. The systematic blinding of captured soldiers has proven that sometimes the most effective victories are won not on battlefields, but in the minds of enemies who have been convinced that resistance leads only to fates worse than death. This lesson has been absorbed by rulers throughout the known world, creating a new understanding of the relationship between cruelty and power that will influence political development throughout medieval Europe. The screams that echoed through the valley of Cledion have been transformed into whispers that reached the throne rooms of every significant ruler in the medieval world, carrying a simple but powerful message about the nature of imperial authority. This is what happens to those who challenge established power when that power has decided that normal moral constraints are obstacles to survival. The 15,000 men who lost their eyes that day became more than victims of medieval warfare. They became symbols of what happens when empires conclude that exceptional cruelty serves humanitarian purposes by preventing longer, more destructive conflicts. The sophistication of Byzantine psychological warfare has also influenced the development of diplomatic and intelligence systems throughout medieval Europe, as rulers have learned that effective terror requires not just the ability to implement systematic brutality, but also the capacity to publicize that brutality in ways that maximize its deterrent effects on potential future threats. The empire's success in transforming the blinding of prisoners into a strategic weapon has created new categories of international relations based on the systematic use of fear as a tool of statecraft. Perhaps most significantly, the success of psychological warfare at Cledion has demonstrated that properly implemented terror can accomplish strategic objectives that might otherwise require generations of conventional military campaigns and vast expenditures of resources that medieval states could ill afford. The complete collapse of Bulgarian resistance through the systematic application of calculated cruelty has proven more efficient than traditional conquest in achieving the empire's long-term strategic goals, creating a model that will influence imperial policy throughout the medieval period and beyond. And so we reach the end of tonight's journey into one of history's most calculated acts of mass brutality, and what we've discovered should disturb anyone who believes that the distance between civilization and savagery is greater than the span of a single strategic decision. The blinding of 15,000 Bulgarian prisoners wasn't a moment of medieval barbarism, driven by bloodlust or religious fanaticism. It was the logical culmination of centuries of imperial strategic thinking that had concluded normal moral constraints were obstacles to survival in a world where empires lived or died based on their ability to convince enemies that resistance was futile. The success of Basil II's psychological warfare campaign reveals something profoundly uncomfortable about human nature and political power that extends far beyond the medieval world and continues to influence how states interact with each other in the modern era. Throughout history, sophisticated civilizations have discovered that systematic cruelty can be more effective than traditional military virtues in achieving long-term strategic objectives. And the precedent established at Cledion influenced military thinking for centuries after the specific political circumstances that produced it had been forgotten by everyone except historians. What happened in that valley in 1014 CE represents more than just Byzantine brutality. It demonstrates how intelligent, sophisticated civilizations can convince themselves that exceptional cruelty serves humanitarian purposes by preventing longer, more destructive conflicts. The imperial administrators who organized the mass mutilation of prisoners weren't sadistic monsters driven by personal hatred of their enemies. They were rational actors implementing policy designed to save lives by making future resistance psychologically impossible for entire populations. The 15,000 men who lost their eyes that day became something more than victims of medieval warfare. They became symbols of what happens when empires decide that survival requires methods that transcend normal moral considerations. Their suffering echoed through history, not just as evidence of Byzantine cruelty, but as proof that psychological warfare could accomplish what traditional military campaigns could not: the complete destruction of an enemy's will to resist through the systematic application of terror, designed to break the psychological foundations of opposition to imperial authority. Perhaps most disturbing is how effectively this strategy worked in both immediate and long-term contexts. Bulgarian independence collapsed not because of military defeat alone, but because the sight of systematic mutilation convinced an entire population that submission was preferable to the alternative of continued resistance and the torture that inevitably followed military defeat. The Byzantine Empire had discovered something that would influence military thinking for centuries. Properly implemented terror could eliminate enemies more efficiently than conquest, occupation, or negotiated settlement. The legacy of systematic psychological warfare that began with those 15,000 blinded prisoners extends far beyond the collapse of Bulgarian resistance and continues to influence how we understand the relationship between state power and individual suffering. The methods developed by Byzantine strategists for transforming human suffering into strategic weapons have been refined and implemented by governments throughout history, creating precedents for the use of systematic cruelty as a tool of statecraft that persists into the modern era. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember that the screams that echoed through the valley of Cleidion in 1014 CE were transformed into whispers that reached throne rooms throughout the medieval world, carrying a message that continues to influence how power operates in human societies. Sometimes, the most effective victories are won not on battlefields, but in the minds of enemies who have been convinced that resistance leads inevitably to fates worse than death. The story of those 15,000 blinded prisoners reminds us that history's most significant moments often reveal uncomfortable truths about the relationship between civilization and cruelty, showing us that the distance between sophisticated statecraft and systematic brutality is often much smaller than we prefer to believe. The empire that considered itself the heir of Rome's greatest traditions proved capable of implementing industrial-scale torture with the same administrative efficiency that it applied to road construction and tax collection, demonstrating that organizational sophistication can serve the darkest purposes just as effectively as the most noble ones. The March of the Blinded through Bulgarian territories represents more than just the aftermath of a military victory. It symbolizes the transformation of human suffering into a strategic weapon that continues to serve imperial interests long after the immediate political crisis has been resolved. Those men became living advertisements for the consequences of challenging established authority, walking reminders that resistance to superior power leads, inevitably, to systematic destruction of everything that makes life worth living. Sweet dreams, and remember that the lessons learned in that valley over 1,000 years ago continue to echo through the corridors of power wherever human beings organize themselves into states capable of systematic cruelty in service of strategic objectives that transcend individual moral considerations.